How's it going, guys? A lot of you have been asking for an update since our first video series on COVID in March of 2020. So here we are in kind of late in the year in November 2020, and we're going to catch up and see how things have progressed since that initial video some months ago. What we're going to cover in this video is jumping right into the current epidemiology. We are not going to discuss the biology like we did in the previous video. I will put a link to it if you need to understand the different testing methods and antibodies and mutations and all of that. We cover that extensively in the first video. I'm going to assume that you have that background and knowledge. If you don't, you'll want to at least watch the first part of the first video. But for this discussion, I'm going to assume that you have the basic biology and virology down that we discussed earlier. After the epidemiology, we'll talk about some updates on the origin of the virus. As you guys are well aware, there is more and more media coverage on how the virus has originated intentionally from a lab in China and all kinds of stuff. So we'll discuss a little bit about that. Reinfection, a lot of coverage that is leading people to believe that if they get the virus and they get over it, that they are going to get reinfected again, and it's caused a lot of concern and fear. So we will discuss the status of that. Mutation, as also many of you are well aware, lots and lots of coverage about mutations of the virus, that there are hundreds of mutations, that there were 19 mutations, thus COVID-19, which is stupid. COVID-19 is because it was discovered in 2019. But that said, there has been one mutation of the virus since our last coverage. If you remember, in our last coverage, I had shown that the index case in the United States actually had perfect homology with the index case in China, in Wuhan. Now there is actually a mutation. Oh no, a mutation, we're all going to die, I know. If you remember from the last video, we don't panic at the word mutation. Our first intelligent, educated question is, what kind of mutation? And it actually was an amino acid mutation in the spike protein. Oh my God. But we're going to talk about that. But yes, there has been a mutation of the virus, and if you catch COVID, it is almost virtually when you catch COVID, it is almost guaranteed to be this mutation variant. So we will talk about the implications of that, and it is not going to be as scary as what the media makes it look. Speaking of the media making this look scary, we're also going to cover a lot of these reports of these odd, scary symptoms, people getting permanent lung damage, people getting organ damage, people getting loss of sensation in their nerves and sense of touch, brain damage, all kinds of horrific, just scary things like that. This photo, by the way, not of somebody who has amputations as a result of COVID. This is actually one of many individuals every year who had amputations as a result of going into septic shock after getting the flu. But of course, we're no longer allowed to compare COVID with the flu, because comparing COVID with the flu means you're uneducated and irresponsible, and quite honestly, that's stupid too. Of course, we're going to compare it not only to the flu, but to other diseases. That's how you get your perspective on how dangerous a disease is by comparing it to other ones that are either more or less dangerous that we are more familiar with. But we'll discuss that. Finally, we're going to discuss the current state of treatments, vaccines, the state of hydroxychloroquine, and all that. So before I begin, just one real quick note. I do want to point out, if you review the previous video in March, right when this whole thing kind of started, we made a lot of predictions in that video. Every single prediction, every single one that we made in our first video, and you can go back and look, it is still there, every single one of them came true. We predicted that there was no possible way that given the R0 values and the progression, that China was accurately reporting their COVID case number. And in fact, about 2 or 3 months afterwards, they did come back with a correction on their reporting, which was much more realistic. We predicted there was absolutely no reason to believe that hydroxychloroquine is going to be the miracle cure for COVID. We were absolutely on target with that. In fact, the FDA recently removed it from their emergency use authorization list because there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that it works. It's only anecdotal and mostly from the president and a golfer who you've never heard of in your life if you're under 50 years old. Gosh, what other predictions did we make? All right, I had to look back and check, but the number of cases they were projecting made no mathematical sense. It is considerably less than what was projected back in March by expert sources, whereas us just using basic virology, biology, and epidemiology, we're able to calculate it much more realistically. And also predicting the impact that this would have. I predicted based on the R0 values and the current spread pattern that within 18 months, it was almost guaranteed that virtually everybody watching this video would have the disease. At the time in March, I believe I had mentioned that you don't know someone who knows someone who tested positive for COVID. Now, today in mid-November, odds are you know someone in your direct circle, at least one person, who has officially tested positive for COVID. Not thought they had COVID, because everybody thought they had COVID and still does, but actually legitimately tested positive. You probably now know someone in that circle, which means that you are not all that distanced from most likely catching this yourself. So all of those predictions did come true. You're welcome to look at those. So given that, let's look at the current epidemiology. All right, at the time in March when we did our first video, we had given the epidemiology at that time, which made it very hard to predict the trajectory of the spread of this disease because we were at the initial growth phase of COVID-19 spread at the time. So we've got 1 million cases here, 500,000 cases here. This is going to be time on the x-axis. And we were at this point where it was still on an upward climb, but we didn't know whether it was going to continue on an upward climb, whether it was going to flatten out. Of course, as you know, there was the flatten the curve momentum that was being promoted at the time to try to prevent that exponential growth so that hospitals wouldn't be overrun. We didn't know if it was even possibly going to go down. Keep in mind, very important throughout this video, to keep in mind the difference between cases and deaths. That's going to become very important for a couple reasons. First of all, as the proportion of deaths to cases has definitely decreased over time, but also to help curve that fear a little bit, that when you look at cases, the overwhelming vast majority of people who have been a COVID case, who have caught COVID, recover perfectly fine. And I've known at least 8 people. Only one of them went to the emergency room. It was a guy who's probably like 82, 83 years old. Most people, especially children, recovered within like 4 days. So just keep that in mind. Currently now, things have changed. So we had, at the time of the last video, I believe it was 500,000 cases and 25,000 deaths. And of course, we were grossly irresponsible and uneducated. I compared that with the flu of 2018, H1N1, and I believe maybe also influenza A, showing that at the time it was much lower in cases and deaths than any of those, but that the trajectory, that was another prediction we made, that the trajectory would show that it would surpass flu cases for 2019 and for previous years, both in cases and deaths, and actually we were right on with that one too. Let's look at what it is today, right now. I think the date is probably like November 13th, I think. Okay, if we look at the current state on the epidemiology globally, as of today, there are now 52 million cases, worldwide with 1.2 million deaths. In the United States, and I realize there are a lot of people watching from other countries, and unfortunately I just keep kind of track with United States numbers. It also represents the largest viewership of the channel, but also in my personal career, working with hospitals and scientists, things like that, I only work in the United States. So it helps to make sure that my perspective on things is accurate, because I've had personal interaction myself with people working on COVID and with hospitals, things like that. But nonetheless, the numbers for the United States are currently 10 million cases and 240,000 deaths. So as you can see, a very significant jump since March, where the U.S. had 500,000 cases, 25,000 deaths. Globally, this will be a global graph. It's looked, if we have time down here from March, the beginning of the disease, to November, currently, if we look at daily cases, it kind of sort of looks something little bit like this, and then this is kind of here where we are in November right now, and kind of on an upswing. So you can see there's kind of been a couple of waves of the disease, and it does look like we are entering a third wave, which makes sense for this time of year as people are more huddled indoors, and you know, any kind of viral transmission like flu, even though you can't compare it, those always get worse around time of year when it's winter anyway, so this would be expected. If we look and do US cases, so now of course our amplitude on the y-axis is going to be reduced because we're only looking at US cases, and it's a little bit more pronounced, these waves in the United States. So that uptick that we covered in the first video would have been right about here, and it did end up kind of increasing and flattening it out, and then it sort of went up a little more. Make sure we're within our numbers. So it's about like that, and kind of flattened out with a little bit of growth, but definitely much flatter. And currently we're in something that is pretty reminiscent of what it looked like in March, where we are in a definite uptick, and of course we can't really tell exactly where this is going to go. Most likely it's going to continue to increase again because of the time of the year. But you can see definitive waves of the virus in the number of cases. And again, wanted to point out earlier, keep in mind the number of cases is not the same as the number of deaths. If it was, trust me, my attitude on this would be a hell of a lot different. Let's get a red marker here. We are going to superimpose a graph of mortality on this. So of course, as you remember in March, we were getting some deaths at that time too, 25,000 at the time. This actually spiked up pretty good, but then, let's see, it was about probably around June or so, we started noticing the daily deaths were decreasing quite a bit, and it actually maintained a pretty low level until, of course, recently, where we've got this spike. So it was maintained pretty reasonably, and now there's a little bit of a jump on that. But when we look at this graph, we can see that the number of deaths reported has actually decreased in proportion to the number of cases. And of course, we would want to think of logical, rational reasons why this may be so. And there are actually it's actually very difficult to do that now, because one of the problems, and this is something I'm familiar with every disease that I've been involved with, studying AIDS back in 1991, as more people got involved with studying this and the literature starts flooding in PubMed and all of the resources, the problem is you get so many conflicting reports, and 50% of people say this thing, 50% of people say this thing. That's the exact diametric and mutually exclusive opposite. Quite honestly, it's really hard for me to filter out and get a definitive answer. Some things I do know that are reasonable to take into consideration, even though they're not definitive, is the testing. So one of the things is that, as you know, we've moved, and we talked about this in the previous video, to more PCR testing, which is considerably more accurate. But we also have a complication in that the PCR testing is so incredibly sensitive that it is entirely possible that you can detect the virus long after a person has recovered from COVID. One of the things we'll talk about in the recurrence of the disease or the reinfection. But the widespread testing available combined with that higher sensitivity means that we are going to see more cases because we've just got everybody and their grandma getting tested, and any hint of viral genetic material is going to show positive. So you're going to get a lot of cases just from that alone. The other thing is that the number of cases that I think were reported earlier may not have necessarily been diagnosed from testing. One thing, if somebody died and they tested positive with COVID antibodies, they counted that as a COVID death. I'm not sure that that's any longer the case, but during the panic at the time and a lot of overreaction and things, you would get an antibody test. I remember seeing an article of somebody who fell off a ladder. They perforated their lung, ended up dying, but it counted as a COVID test. They were tested positive for the antibodies for COVID. So some of those things can explain it, given your knowledge that we have from the first video on how the testing works and things. You can kind of put together your own conclusions here. They're as good as anyone else's, by the way, but I'm just giving the facts here. This is just simply the current state. You can come up with your own explanations. Okay, one thing I want to do before we move to the next section, I do want to kind of explode in more specifically on the U.S. COVID deaths, because on the previous graph, it would be a little irresponsible for me to just leave that. I just kind of wanted to show the general death curve in proportion to the cases, but the actual y-axis amplitude would have been off quite a bit there. So it would have looked like there were way more deaths than what there actually were. When we focus in on the COVID deaths, our y-axis is going to be in the single-digit thousands, actually, and this is going to be daily deaths. So we had kind of a little bit of a spike early in March, and again, I believe for some of the reasons I listed. As time went by, we had a decrease in the deaths, and the death rate was, for the longest time, hovering kind of close to the 1,000 deaths a day. With a little variance here. And then, of course, currently at this particular moment in time, we're a little bit up here, again, because of the current spike in COVID cases. So the proportion is going to carry that death rate up. But I just wanted to give a more accurate perspective so it didn't look like we were having 50,000 people a day dying in the U.S. It's not that I'm belittling it. That is a lot of people, for sure, but we just wanted to get a more accurate perspective of it. You can compare this to other things, car accidents, heart attacks, general flu, things like that, and you can do your own comparisons on where this falls so that you have a perspective on how deadly the disease is. And I will save you guys some time as far as things like the flu or whatever. Of course, I have already done this, but I don't want to be irresponsible and compare it to the flu. Yeah, there is no question that it has surpassed lethality of what the flu is by several folds. So no question about it. I did tell you that COVID is not the flu in the last video, and that is apparent in that there is a higher death rate associated with COVID, but it is not going to be the end of the world. Okay, at this time, I want to answer one question, and there were a lot of people that were talking about, hey, whatever happened to the flu anyway? It seems like they never report on how the flu season is this year, and are people still catching the flu? It would seem the flu just totally went away. And to be honest with you, that's I don't know, that's kind of difficult. One of the things is at this point, it is a little difficult to make more direct comparisons with COVID and the flu, because they're measured differently. Keep in mind, let me kind of explain this a little more clearly. When we look at that COVID has passed the cases of the flu and the deaths of the flu, which is true, and I did mention that, and that is absolutely true. You have to keep in mind that there is a vaccine for the flu. There's like always been a vaccine for the flu. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is you're comparing a disease that does not currently have a vaccine with one that does have a vaccine. One of the things you want to think about is if there was no vaccine for the flu, how many cases and deaths would we have? Horribly irresponsible and uneducated to ask that question if you talk to the media and the experts and everything. But it's a legitimate question. If there was no vaccine for the flu, where would we be? Would it actually even be more deadly than COVID? We don't know. We don't have ways of answering that. The other thing is keep in mind that when we're talking about the number of cases of COVID, these are almost invariably going to be confirmed cases from the testing of COVID. And there's 3 different ways you can test. As you know, you've got your PCR test, you've got your antibody test, and you also have an antigen test. We covered those in the previous video. When we look at the numbers for flu cases and deaths, that is not done from testing results of the flu. Those are done from mathematical models because, as you are well familiar, the overwhelming vast majority of people who get the flu don't get a test. And even if they go to the doctor, they don't get a test. So it's not from testing, and the mathematical models for the flu really kind of suck. Some models show that there are 10 million cases a year of the flu. That is absolutely ludicrous. That would mean you don't know anyone who got the flu. There are other ones that show that there are as much as 40 million cases of the flu a year. Again, mathematical modeling. What they usually do is they take an average of these mathematical models, and we can assume realistically probably 25 million cases of the flu each year with probably between 50 and 70,000 deaths. So you can use that as a perspective, but it's just a difficult comparison because you're not using the same baseline of measurement to determine the cases. So it does make it a little more challenging, but that's all we have right now, and it is a little frustrating. But yeah, it does seem like the flu is completely irrelevant nowadays, despite the fact that we have tens of thousands of deaths each year from the flu, and nobody panics from that. All right, let's move on to the next topic, and that is going to be origin. Okay, so in the previous video, I had mentioned that we do not have any evidence or reason to suspect that this was intentionally released from a laboratory as a weapon or some kind of economic impact type of thing from China. All we knew is a couple of things. Based on the sequence homology, the sequence homology showed that this did have perfect homology to indicate that it was from bat coronavirus. Okay. That is still absolutely, completely, 100% true. I have read ridiculous things, such as the AIDS virus was incorporated into this, and sequence homology to the AIDS virus indicates that this was intentionally created. It is so ridiculous. First of all, it's not true. And second of all, even if it was, all viruses share some level of homology because they are viruses. It would almost be like saying, hey, somebody injected orangutan DNA into this human. Well, yeah, we've got 98% homology to orangutans. So it's just so ridiculous and quite honestly kind of frustrating for people who are educated like this, like you guys are if you watch the first video. It came from bat coronavirus. Now, we cannot scientifically say, it is impossible to scientifically say whether this was a zoonotic transmission, that is from the bat to human in some way, or through a medial source like what was the name of the animal that they suspected? I can't remember. But that ultimately this was transmitted from the animal to human. Or it is possible that they took the bat coronavirus in a lab, mutated it somehow to make it transmissible to humans, and administered it somehow that humans would be infected. Sure, that's possible. The bottom line is that whichever it was, if it was intentionally released from a lab or if it came from nature, it is from bat coronavirus. So, whatever you want to believe on that, I'm not going to come to a conclusion on it. I will also tell you this, that when you have a laboratory sourced virus, a virus created in a laboratory, that does not mean it was created as a weapon. It almost never does. I have made viruses, I can't even count how many, for therapeutic research. So, for example, in the same way that a virus can deliver genetic material to the cells and create more viruses and do bad things, one of my projects is let's make viruses that do the opposite. They inject genetic material into cells that do good things, like produce insulin in a person who is diabetic, that kind of thing. And even then, viruses aren't my favorite. I prefer nanoparticles because you have less immune reaction to a benign virus. But just because a virus came from a lab does not mean that it is a bioweapon. It is almost certainly not. Could be they were just studying the coronavirus. It wasn't anything to do with a therapeutic. They were just characterizing that coronavirus and it got out of the lab. Possible. Absolutely possible. But, you'll have to come up with your own conclusions. The point on this topic is that it did originate from bat coronavirus. It is not a hybrid of other deadly viruses. I've seen AIDS, Ebola, malaria, other things. That is complete whacknut thinking, and that just because if it is determined that it actually did come from a lab, it doesn't mean anything malicious was intended. So that's kind of the status of that. Quite honestly, I don't see how it would be possible scientifically to prove conclusively that it originated from a lab. I don't know how that would even happen, but we're going to see a lot of speculation. Okay, let's talk to this topic on something that is definitely a concern more with people because it is reported more and more and more and more frequently, and that is evidence of reinfection. That is, you catch coronavirus, it is confirmed through testing, then you get better, and then a couple months later, you get sick again, you readmit to the hospital or to your doctor or whatever, you get tested, and you have it again. So you got a reinfection. So first of all, the idea that this is something specific with coronavirus, that people have evidence of reinfection, is ridiculous in itself. Since the 1980s, when we have had PCR available, it has been found and debated that the cold, the flu, common upper respiratory viruses have shown evidence of reinfecting very rarely, but there is some pretty convincing evidence that there have been people who have had reinfection. So the idea that it's this magical characteristic of the coronavirus, this coronavirus seems to have all these magical abilities beyond what any other virus has. And the idea of reinfection, it has been around since the days of PCR testing. So do keep in mind that there probably have been many people who have been reinfected with the cold and with the flu and with other viruses. So even if there is reinfection, it is not specifically a special characteristic of coronavirus. Now, that said, the overwhelming, vast majority of virologists and immunologists are going to universally agree that they're going to be very skeptical that there is common reinfection as a result of this or any other viral infection. When you make antibodies to the virus, you have a memory of that. There is nothing special about the virus that it would make your body forget how to produce the antibodies or make the antibodies useless against the virus. There is no evidence for this. And sometimes it's a way of how you look at this. the media is going to report that there is no evidence whatsoever that you cannot get reinfected, whereas of course I'm going to say there is no evidence whatsoever that you can get reinfected. And it's kind of analogous to saying, I'm going to say there is no evidence whatsoever that there is a Bigfoot or a Loch Ness monster, where of course other people are going to say there is no evidence that there is not a Bigfoot or Loch Ness monster. And that's kind of the game that can be played here. I will tell you, based on what we learned in the previous video, and we didn't go into B cells and T cells and things like that specifically, but your immune system is an incredibly strong defense once you develop antibodies, either through a vaccine or through natural immune system development to an antigen. There is absolutely no reason to think that you are going to get a reinfection unless there is a major mutation that would change the conformation, the structural conformation of the virus, where it would no longer be recognized. Any doctor, any epidemiologist, any virologist, any immunologist especially, is going to be extraordinarily skeptical of that. That said, there are a couple of notable cases. There are two of them. Patient presented in, I want to say, March, maybe April, and they tested positive for coronavirus with an antibody test. So at the time they had an antibody test and confirmed coronavirus. They were treated, I believe, in the emergency room or something, and then sent home. Patient gets much better. What was it, 2 months later? I want to say it was 2 months later. They present again at the emergency room with a much worse condition than before. They get a PCR test. PCR test confirms positive for coronavirus. At this point, I think they were admitted to the hospital overnight, treated and released, but clear case of reinfection. Or was it? Again, remember, think back to the PCR test. You've got a patient who presents with COVID-19, and if we kind of look in there and through the antibody test, they test positive. Now, we know from the biology of the virus that means that there are virus particles in this person's body. If there's virus particles, there's going to be genetic material from that virus. Now, we fast forward a couple months later, and now they did a PCR test. They actually did a quantitative PCR, qPCR test. And the qPCR test was positive. If there was even one remaining virus, a PCR test is so sensitive that it would have detected that genetic material and been positive. Now, one of the things is that they did PCR testing, I think at 1 month, and it was negative. But again, the swab may not have picked up the antigen at that time, but then 2 months later it was still picked up. It is absolutely entirely reasonable that you can have these virus particles hanging around in your body for weeks or months and may or may not be detected because there's such low count of them. So this, to me, is anything but conclusive that there was reinfection. The other thing that would have been nice is if they also did an influenza test. Was he positive for influenza A? I have a friend who had exactly this happen. And what actually happened is he tested negative on a PCR test when he went into the doctor, but he was sick. So they tested negative, whatever. Then he gets sick again 2 months later, tests positive on the PCR test for COVID, but also tested positive for influenza A. So did he have COVID or did he have influenza A or both? Or did he have COVID back at this test, but it tested negative? Who knows? But the thing is that there is no convincing evidence here that there was definitive reinfection. There is another case, one other case that is commonly referenced when the media talks about reinfection, and it's actually weaker than this one. All right, so bottom line on this, can you get reinfected with COVID? Possibly so. You can also get reinfected with the same cold virus. You can get reinfected with the same flu virus. It is possible you could get reinfected, but if so, the evidence is overwhelming, also from the epidemiology, because you would have more than exponential growth because people would keep getting reinfected every couple months. It is pretty overwhelmingly obvious that if people get reinfected, they are anomalies and that it is exceedingly rare. So definitely wouldn't worry too much about that. And also it is even more evidence that every reason to believe that a vaccine is going to quickly subside a lot of these cases and the spread of the virus. Okay, here's where things get a little more interesting since the previous video for sure, in that the greatest fear of all, the virus mutates. So hopefully you guys are all educated and responsible when we talk about mutations, that you understand what we are talking about specifically because you paid attention in the first video and you are already asking questions, intelligent, logical, rational, relevant questions about the fact that I did say there has been a mutation. So, first of all, there's been a lot of reports on a lot of these mutations. I will tell you, there is no question there has been one that is of specific interest. It is the D416G spike protein mutation. And this, when they talk about that Dr. Fauci is concerned about this new mutation, or the CDC is concerned about this new mutation, this is what they're going to be referring to. There have, of course, been other mutations, because this always happens with viruses, but every one of them has been a non-amino acid effective mutation. So just simple, we call them what do we call them? Single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs for short, or just single base mutations, maybe even more than that, but nothing that has changed the structure, the lock and key structure of the virus shape, where it would recognize, say, this ACE receptor through a lock and key. Nothing like that has happened as of yet. Although this spike protein is the actual region in that virus shape, we'll draw a little spike here, and this is what would recognize the ACE2 here. And there has been a change in this part of the virus. So we will discuss that. But one thing to keep in mind is that through the fact that there have been reported mutations of the virus, they are actually slower than other viruses. So when people start talking about how this virus, again, has this magical ability to do what no other virus before has ever been able to do, actually, this is a thing where it actually sucks compared to other viruses as far as its evolution, in that it actually undeniably has mutated slower, which is good news, again, for vaccine as well. The other thing is that this spike protein, let's kind of look at this in a little more detail and what a D416G mutation is. So, of course, you've got your, as we talked about in part one, I don't want to go too much into biology because it'll be repetitive. So you got your DNA sequence of the virus. As we remember, every 3 of these is a codon that codes for an amino acid. And then, so this would be amino acid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As we go down to amino acid 614, and I don't know what the genetic code is here, but whatever this DNA codon would be, and it would code for AD, which is the abbreviation for, what is D? Aspartate, I think, is D. Aspartate or asparagine. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure it's aspartate. But one of these DNA bases in here changed, that changed this D to a G, which is glycine. Now, as we know, that in itself would be a reasonable concern, because now you have an amino acid change, and as we talked about in the previous video, now we're talking about a legitimate mutation. But we still have to make some kind of alteration as a result of this. So we're going to draw a spike here, and then maybe a little square here, and we're going to say our virus looks something like that as far as the shapes for the lock and key theory of antigen and antibody reception. And this area here is known as the spike protein. And that D to G is in this spike protein. Now, why would this be of concern? Well, it is because the spike protein is the region of the virus, that epitope of the virus, that would bind to your cells through, as we described in the first video, the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptors. So a change in that spike protein can affect the virus's ability to bind to cells. Now, of course, the media jumps right to the panic button in that a change in the spike protein, and because that protein is essential for binding to the cells, this is going to make the virus more virulent. Virulence meaning it is going to be more infectious. It's going to make you sicker. This is the big fear we all had. They said it wouldn't mutate, and it mutated right in the most important region. Again, just think of the biology. Think of the first video where we talked about this. First of all, let's just make it in the most basic thing by looking at the potential outcomes and the percentage chance that this mutation would make the virus more virulent. We would get a 33% chance that it would be more virulent. Why? Because at the most basic way of looking at this, we have 3 possible outcomes. The mutation makes it more virulent. The mutation has no effect. And the other one that nobody ever seems to consider is the actual higher likelihood that the mutation would make it less virulent. May even kill the virus because it makes it where it can no longer bind to the cells, not bind better. There is no reason to think any over the other, but it's just amazing, absolutely amazing how the media jumps right to the thing that this is going to be the cause of the end of civilization, this mutation in the virus. Just at its most basic level, there is a 2/3 chance that it is not going to make it more virulent. 1/3 chance it would make it less virulent. Now, we can also look at it much more scientifically, and that is we would do studies through ELISA, like we mentioned on the first video, where we would see, is the virus more likely to bind to ACE2 or less likely? Well, what did I just say like 15 minutes ago? Half the people report it binds better, half the people report it doesn't. I don't know. I will tell you this, though. One of the things is that the media also talks about how this kills the hopes of a vaccine, and that all the vaccine research is a complete waste of time because of this mutation. The vaccine still recognizes this. There has not been a change in the conformation of the spike protein that it wouldn't be recognized by the antibody. As a matter of fact, the trick with the antibody is you also make the antibody to other regions of it. It's called polyclonal, so that the antibody recognizes different regions. So if you do have a change in one region, you still have the antibody bind. The idea that this legitimate actual mutation will render a vaccine useless is completely ludicrous, and it is just hype from the media. Again, the fear-mongering and the misinformation is considerably more virulent. But that's the current state of mutation. You will start hearing more specifically about the D416G spike particularly, and that's of course also because nobody understands what that means. And therefore, when people don't understand something, it does tend to increase their fear. And, I know I sound biased against the media with this, but it just seems blatantly, overwhelmingly obvious to me that there is an attempt to create more fear than what needs to be done, because they don't explain this part of it, which you guys understand. But yes, there has been a mutation. So I am being responsible in reporting that not only has there been a mutation, but with the exponential growth phase of the virus, and at the time this mutation was detected, that is the one that you are likely to get if you get diagnosed with COVID. By the way, the very fact that you still get diagnosed with COVID through a test means that it hasn't altered all that much. The other thing, too, to keep in mind about these mutations, this is a particular frustration with the way these are detected, is they're, of course, detected by sequencing the virus, and there is like a 2 to 3% error rate in sequencing. So it's really frustrating. It's something I've dealt with all the time, where you sequence something and it doesn't match what originally you expected. Is it a sequencing error because you got up to a 3% error rate, or is it a legitimate change? So you have to sequence it again. You sequence it again, you find that your original area where you had detected a change is now the same as it was before, but because of the 3% error rate, you have other errors now. So you're constantly chasing these, and it's really frustrating. I do have some concern that some of the mutations that were reported could have been sequencing errors, because people jumped to reporting this to the media as soon as possible. But then when peers do the sequencing and they also consistently find that same mutation, only then do you determine there is a legitimate mutation, which is how D416G was finally characterized. But I'm pretty skeptical that other mutations aren't really as scrutinized as much as that. But there you have your mutation status for today. Okay, what are we on? Number 5 now, I think. And that is a lot of this reporting you see on odd, scary, permanent symptoms that, again, specific allegedly to the coronavirus. The coronavirus, again, has these incredibly, phenomenally magical abilities that other viruses don't have to do these bizarre things and cause all of these crazy symptoms, from neuronal damage, brain damage, permanent organ failure, blah, blah, and all that. Again, not to minimize it, because obviously it has happened. But again, as you can put together by now, 2 things. First of all, not unique to coronavirus. As a matter of fact, here are some examples of some very unusual symptoms. And these are things you can actually Google yourself, but we can see this guy here who actually, as a result of septic shock from the flu, had a triple amputation, permanent brain damage, permanent organ damage. Again, that's from the flu, not from coronavirus. Same with this woman here, as a result of a septic shock from the flu. This little boy, if I remember correctly, it was either this little boy or the girl on the left. I think it was the boy that died from the common cold. As a result of a cytokine storm where his immune system overreacted, and dies from the common cold. The 19-year-old cheerleader on the left dies as a result of influenza A. So again, not to minimize the deaths from COVID and the tragedies that caused, but again, the point of this is to show that the fact that COVID can cause not only deaths, but unusual symptoms. You haven't seen any amputations as a result of COVID, for example. But as soon as it happens, oh, believe me, they will cover that. But the irresponsibility with not putting it into perspective that this is nothing unique to the virus. And as a matter of fact, these conditions I'm showing with these unfortunate patients here, that's also not unique to the cold virus or flu virus either. It is unique to their immune response, which is the explanation for this topic on the odd symptoms. The odd symptoms that people get are not a result of the virus doing dastardly evil things to people, and that there's something maybe that it was programmed or whatever, and that it has all these unusual characteristics. It's because different people's immune systems react differently, and your immune responses, as we discussed in the first video, if you remember, your immune responses are really more of what generates the lethality of the virus and a lot of the more severe symptoms, because your immune system overreacts to the virus. Particularly, we showed this with the flu of 1918, where there was it happened to be something about the virus that younger people, the exact opposite of COVID, where older people have this phenomenon, but younger people with the flu of 1918 had this severe overreaction. We call it SEERS. And that is where a lot of these things, like maybe the loss of the sense of smell that they report, tingling sensations in your fingers, also things like permanent lung damage can be the result of your immune system, as we discussed in the first video, fighting against pneumonia, where sometimes your immune system response is worse than the disease. But that's the explanation for a lot of these weird, odd symptoms or these more severe symptoms. You know, sure, of course, the media is going to go through, out of the 25,000 deaths or whatever, they're going to pluck out the most heinous and fear-inducing ones, healthy athletes, children, people who have had severe lung trauma, things like that. And of course, they're going to pluck those out. But as you see, we can play that game too, and you can pluck that out with the common cold. And nobody, you know, you still, for some reason, you still are not as inclined to be as afraid of the flu, even after I showed you these cases. But that's not because of the fact that it's any less deadly. It's because you are just inundated every single day from the media. COVID, 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 COVID. You can imagine if the media were to decide they were going to make everybody afraid of the flu. They have the ammunition to do it. I just showed it. And if you did that every single day, man, you know, people wouldn't even go outside because of the flu. So that is my explanation for the odd symptoms. Again, there is no evidence that there is anything specific about the virus. It's just you're going to find out of 25,000 deaths, some people are going to express symptoms that are not as common as the vast majority of other people who succumb to the virus. So again, just try to curb the fear a little bit. But it is hard to do when you're inundated with this every day. That brings us to our final topic, and that is the state of treatments and hopefully when this is all going to end. So I think that was our last one, part 6, treatments and therapies and things. So as we have found out, hydroxychloroquine did not turn out to be the miracle drug as we knew, because there was no mechanism that could be justified on how it would work. And scientists and hopefully doctors do not take anecdotal evidence. As a matter of fact, you've heard, I believe Dr. Fauci has said that many times, that he does not accept anecdotal evidence, and he is absolutely right about that. If you're looking for somebody who is an actual physician to trust, I would agree Dr. Fauci, probably your best bet. But again, the way he delivers the information can sometimes be a little panic-inducing. But I believe that's because in his position, he just has to really, we call it CYA, cover your ass. He has to be very careful in minimizing anything, because obviously that's going to come back to haunt him throughout history if he's wrong. So you're going to see him be very precautious and, just a little bit anal retentive in that regard. Actually, a lot so. But in his position, that's his job to do that. So, I have yet to see anything he says that isn't really accurate. That said, as you've heard, there are some very big high hopes for a vaccine from Pfizer as of today. Hey, by the way, another prediction that we made in the first video that came true. I had predicted that when a vaccine comes out, that it is going to almost guaranteed be an RNA vaccine and not the weakened virus or dead virus or the antigen-based vaccine that many people are familiar with. And that is exactly the one that the Pfizer is. As a matter of fact, the other vaccines in production actually have been held up in their testing because of some complications, and those are the ones with the weakened virus or the dead virus or the recombinant production of antigen to produce the vaccine. But the RNA vaccine is indeed the most hopeful one, and we did predict that. So once again, just simple biology, simple science, without politicizing it, and you can make some pretty accurate predictions there. So when we see this vaccine come out, it's going to be an RNA vaccine, so it's not going to be weakened virus, it's not going to be dead virus. Of course, I'm not going to say that you should or should not take the vaccine. That is not my place to do so. But just be aware that it's going to be an RNA-based vaccine. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, ain't no way I'm getting injected with COVID, that's not how it's going to work. That said, the fear of vaccines is going to probably be the biggest problem when this vaccine is released. I anticipate it's probably going to be 70% effective. But unfortunately, because of idiots like this guy,
I might even go so far as to say that this face mask is more guaranteed to protect me against COVID than when I take a COVID vaccine.
Now, it wouldn't be nearly so unfortunate if that incompetent moron didn't happen to be the head of the CDC for the United States. But what he said was the equivalent of somebody telling you that this 3-letter password will protect your computer better than a firewall and antivirus software. That's how incompetent that statement was. And it's even worse if the person who told you that this would be better of password protection than having a firewall and antivirus software, if that was the head of your internet security department, the virus is the least of our concerns. But the problem is, in my opinion, that this vaccine is going to be tremendously effective, but when you've got irresponsible morons like that incidentally, he did recall that statement after just about every single doctor, every single scientist, and every single person who passed 8th grade biology jumped all over him for that. And even then, he didn't really recall it. He clarified it, if I remember his terminology correctly or whatever. But the problem is when we have people like that in those positions, that again creates fear and distrust in the vaccine. The problem is that I think we're going to run into a problem where a lot of people may not take the vaccine, which is then, of course, going to kind of perpetuate this problem a lot more than necessary. But when the vaccine comes out, which at this rate should be early next year, most likely, which is remarkable. I will say from a personal standpoint, having made vaccines, not for human use, but even just in research applications where I need to make a vaccine to study an antigen, the soonest, the earliest I was able to make one in a lab was like a year and a half. That's just making it in the lab. That's not testing it through trials and things like that with humans and animal testing and all this kind of stuff. The idea that we made this vaccine in less than a year, I honestly have to tell you that is so unprecedented. It's absolutely incredible, absolutely amazing. So, when people sit around and say that the administration didn't do anything about COVID, you can say what you want, and certainly, Trump talking about hydroxychloroquine made me cringe every frickin' time. But the fact that that we got a vaccine out that quickly, that's unbelievable. So obviously a lot went into that. And, credit's due where it is and blame is too. But the problem with the vaccine is, in my opinion, going to be a lot like the problem with the PPE, the masks and the gloves, is that people won't use it correctly. As a matter of fact, let's go back to that clip. And notice here how he's actually contaminating the inside of his mask with his fingers. Something I pointed out in the first video, that's one of the main reasons we're going to find PPE isn't going to be effective, is because people don't know how to use it. Oh boy. That vaccine is going to be good news, and I think that's going to make a major impact in things, hopefully help prevent shutdowns and stuff like that. But of course, probably because of the current administration that this vaccine came under, and statements like we just heard. There's probably going to be some apprehension at using the vaccine. I don't think the media is going to embrace it a huge amount. So, that's unfortunate, but when you look all throughout history, every time scientists have discovered something good, the general masses in general do not accept it readily. So, but that is the case with the vaccine. As far as other treatments, nothing has shown to really be very effective at all. There are a couple of sort of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory cocktails that I believe are approved for emergency use authorization for severely reactive patients. Again, remember, these are not so much to treat the virus as they are to treat that SIRS, that severe inflammatory response syndrome that can ultimately lead to a lot of the more severe symptoms, including death. Also, sepsis as a result of any infection is something that you want to be very careful of and very adamant about treating. So the vaccine, though, is specifically for preventing infection from the virus, and that would be your strongest therapeutic, overwhelmingly, by far. Okay, so that brings you up to date on at least everything I know about the current state of things. One thing that is kind of nice, the biology never changes. The biology is still the same. So the point of this is, if I don't make another update video, because quite honestly, YouTube is getting kind of touchy on these things. So I don't want to disrupt the usual flow with my channel and possibly risk my monetization and everything. So I may not make too many of these. But the bottom line is, given the knowledge that you have, especially from the first video, which I will link to, you can take the information that comes, and you maybe don't really need me to explain it as much. You can take your knowledge of the basic biology and put together your own conclusion on how accurate that information is, how fear-inducing it really should be, how you should react to it. And hopefully the point of this video is to help you better make your own decisions because you're much more educated on the mechanisms. So, thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.